Good morning, everyone. We still have a few people joining us, but I think I'll go ahead and get started to keep us on time. I'm Jana Irwin, head of education at the Ulrich, and we are delighted to have all of you with us this morning for our third Ulrich Virtual Senior Wednesday program with our newest addition to our staff, Joe Cox. Before I introduce Joe, I want to catch you up on what's new at the Ulrich since we last met. In August, we installed Alice Aycock's Twister Grande Tall in Roundabout off 17th in the East Campus. And our exhibition, Alice Aycock in the Studio, is open by appointment through November 30th. A lovely way to spend a little time with art after such a long hiatus. Our September round of billboards are up, including works by Matika Wilbur, Larry Schwarm, Kevin Mullins, Jane Quick-to-See-Smith, and Kajin Fujita. Kajin joined us from LA yesterday evening to talk about K2S Crew and the evolution of his work. If you weren't able to attend, it is available on our YouTube channel, along with all of our virtual programs. Our next Ulrich Virtual Artist Talk is Tuesday, September 22nd at 6 p.m. with photographer Terry Evans. And our next Senior Wednesday will feature Stephanie Danker from the University of Miami, who will talk about curriculum ideas inspired by Gordon Parks that she has included in her art education curriculum this semester. As always, you can register for all of our virtual programs at ulrich.wichita.edu. Joe Cox joined the Ulrich last spring as our registrar, just weeks before the museum shut down due to the newly implemented COVID restrictions, far from ideal when starting a new job. But she has been a powerhouse throughout and an amazing addition to our team. Joe comes to the Ulrich from Elkhorn Valley Museum in Norfolk, Nebraska, where she managed a collection of over 10,000 artifacts and facilitated the merger with Nebraska Music Hall of Fame. There she curated Picture Us, Northeast Nebraska in photos in a century of the camera, as well as dress code, frills, fashion, and function. She has also contributed exhibition materials to a number of shows at the Tyler Museum of Art, such as Christo and Jean-Claude, the Tom Golden Collection, Embracing Diverse Voices, 90 Years of African American Art, and Ansel Adams' Early Works. Joe earned her BA in Art History from the University of Texas at Tyler and is currently working on her thesis in fulfillment of her MA from University of Texas. Help me welcome Joe Cox. Hi, Joe.
Hello. Thank you, Jana, for the kind words. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Cox, the Ulrich's new registrar, as Jana introduced me. And I'm coming to you this morning from the lovely staff offices at the Ulrich, where the magic happens. I was talking to Jana earlier, I wanted to do the talk from our incredible vault because it's such a sight. But it occurred to me at 10:30 in the morning that I would need both coffee and water throughout the talk, which is a vault no-no, if you didn't know. So here I am in the office, and I want to thank you for joining us. Hopefully you were able to catch the talk last night with Kajin Fujita. Really, really neat to hear him talk from his studio. And hopefully you'll continue participating in our free virtual events. Today, let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully this is all working. Today we are going to talk about Swedish early abstract artist Hilma af Klint, who lived between 1862 and 1944. And we're going to talk specifically about her process in terms of making these early abstract works. Af Klint has been getting long due attention lately, especially after the massive retrospective at the Guggenheim in 2018. But I stumbled upon the artist in 2016 and was intrigued. And just as a side personal note, one of my cat's middle names is Hilma, because I was researching the artist so heavily when I got her. But what I immediately found was two factions of historians. There are still those who are open to naming her as a pioneer in abstract art. And then there are those who insist that it is her intentions, which are well documented in journals, that are different from her male counterparts of the time, thus separating her from the movement. Kliint was a spiritual medium. She was heavily involved in the occult and mysticism, theosophy, and this seems to hurt her in some cases, her artistic credibility in the eyes of some. So I wrote a paper arguing for her place in the canon, and my thought was that if intention was the only thing in question, I wanted to compare her theories and her motivations to those of the big names that we think of in early abstraction, mainly Kandinsky, because he wrote and wrote and wrote about what he was doing and why he was doing it, right? So then I presented the paper in 2017, and I'm excited to be talking about her again. At that point in 2017, the largest, most thorough, and most attention-generating solo Kliint exhibition had been held at the Modern Art Museum in Stockholm in 2013, and that still remains a landmark exhibition for the artist. So many parts of my talk today will be extracted directly from that paper, and we will look at a ton of images. I managed to condense 52 slides down into around 30. So we'll see a lot of images and hopefully have a good time. First, let's take a quick look at abstraction. So abstraction was at its core liberation from representation, right? It was to be the visualization of the invisible. It was highly regarded in the early 20th century as being the true art, the pure art, the new art. It was also highly competitive, to name the first abstract work in retrospect. It was honestly quite the horse race, with a handful of artists neck and neck, all just centimeters from abstraction. And when you think of abstract art, many of you will go directly to household names like Kandinsky, Mondrian on the left, obviously Kandinsky on the right here. You may also think of Kupka, Francis Picabia, Paul Klee. Pictured, of course, are two giants in the art world in their mature eras. And when we look at where these artists began, it gives a little bit of insight into their process in sort of inching toward abstraction. For example, it's easy to see in Mondrian's work how he began fracturing his images, painting, in the post-impressionist era, experimenting sort of with pointillism perhaps, and then until his images were no longer representational. We see a similar trajectory with Kandinsky. And although in this slide, these are very big leaps in his body of work, you can get a sense of how he arrived at his mature style. And the watercolor there on the right from 1910 is widely considered to be the first abstract painting. Although it is a difficult claim to prove, Kandinsky, of course, himself boasted this. But some historians consider this problematic because it's believed that Kandinsky actually dated this watercolor in 1913. And I should also add that Picabia has an oil painting from 1909 that's purely abstract. So there's that horse race. But predating all of this are the early works of Hilma af Klint, whose earliest very large scale abstract works are dated 1907 to 1908. However, we don't really see that clear sort of progression with af Klint, as she went from academic painting to full-on abstraction. And then she continued doing landscapes and portraiture alongside of her abstract works, though she never exhibited her abstract works. It's easy to see she was working a little bit ahead of her time, according to canon, with fully realized geometric abstraction a decade before Kandinsky here, and significantly predating other pioneering movements. Af Klint was born in Stockholm in 1862. She began practicing seances in 1879. And the interest in the spiritual was sort of strengthened by the death of her sister the following year. She attended the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Stockholm in 1882. And after graduating in 1887, she begins working in a studio with 2 other female artists in Stockholm, but she's painting mainly landscapes. By 1896, af Klint regularly attends spiritual meetings with her 4 female friends, and they established themselves as a group called the Five. During their seances, they make contact with so-called high masters, and the Five begin to document their experiences in notebooks. The group also practices automatic writing and drawing, which means writing and drawing without consciously guiding the movement of the pen on the paper. And just as a side note, the high masters did have names, and they introduced themselves as Gregor, Clemens, Amaliel, and Ananda. It was during a 1904 seance that af Klint is commissioned by one of the high masters, Amaliel, to make her series, which amounts to 193 works called Paintings for the Temple. And in this case, the temple is not to be considered a material place, but represented as a spiritual plane. This is an example of an automated drawing from around that time. And you will be able to see elements, very clearly see elements in her paintings that are here, as far as meandering lines, biomorphic shapes, a sense of symmetry. And these are 2 more automated drawings by the Five from around 1903. So uncovering the work of af Klint over 40 years after her death in 1944 generated, as I'm sure you can assume, insatiable curiosity. Perhaps the most intriguing factor being the artist's written instructions left with her estate to postpone exhibiting her work at least 20 years after her death. She did not want to exhibit during her lifetime, and then she instructed with her estate to not exhibit any of her work until 20 years after her death. Several of her abstract paintings, most made between 1906 and 1920, were exhibited for the first time in 1986 as part of a show at the LA County Museum of Art that was addressing a role of spiritualist or occult influences in abstract art. The reception of af Klint in the same galleries as Kandinsky and Mondrian wavered between enthusiasm and distaste, the latter of which can be summarized by art critic Hilton Kramer, who reviewed the show and called af Klint's presence, quote, absurd, alongside the true forefathers of abstraction. Kramer would go on to write that, quote, af Klint is simply not an artist in their class and would never have been given this inflated treatment if she had not been a woman, end quote. Since then, af Klint's work has been steadily shown internationally, although the Modern Museum of Art in Stockholm's 2013 exhibition, Hilma af Klint, A Pioneer of Abstraction, was the most comprehensive to date, including freshly removed work freshly removed from wooden crates, last touched by af Klint herself. And there's also been, as I mentioned, the 2018 retrospective at the Guggenheim, which is very significant. One of the most striking attributes of af Klint's work is that it communicates in a symbolic code, a system of imagery and compositional elements deciphered in her own handwriting for future generations. Over 125 journals and notebooks amounting to 26,000 pages. We'll pop back over to that slide. 26,000 pages of the artist's notes were packed away with her paintings that outline the meaning behind her use of color, form, and imagery. Af Klint's desire for her visual language to be decoded aligns with the inclinations of artists like Mondrian, whose first of countless essays, entitled The New Plastic in Painting of 1917, asserts his philosophies and paralleled aesthetic aims. Kupka's similarly themed Creation in the Plastic Arts of 1913. And Kandinsky, who penned his treatise concerning the spiritual in art around the same time, came out in 1912. Though the universally recognized group of pioneering abstract artists arrived at the new art by way of various paths, a common thread can be traced through intention. The supremely modernist aversion to copying nature as it appears had reached its peak, experimentally distorted and stretched through symbolism, cubism, but the manipulation of form was still rooted in the physical world. Those concerned with visualizing invisible ideas were charged with not only creating a new visual language, but explaining why the old methods were no longer valid. For many of these artists, their accompanying writings consisted of philosophical and spiritual discourse of the time, with the vast majority adhering to the confluence of the two, which took shape in the late 19th century with the theosophical doctrine of Helena Blavatsky and had an immense following by the early 20th century. Theosophical concepts promoted existence on multiple planes, emphasizing the access of these spiritual layers of humankind to better understand our oneness. This kind of inward meditation emerged at an opportune time when an unsettling, rapid succession of scientific discoveries and industrial advancements plunged society into the unknown future at an overwhelming pace. In response to modern anxiety, artists seemed to retreat inward. Abstract theory was born from this same tone, seeking to modify visual communication to better reflect these spiritual philosophies and address dual concepts like the body and the soul, the material and the spiritual. Providing an encyclopedic account of her visual language, or as she claimed, the spiritual dictation that passed through her, this promotes Klint's intention of creative control and originality. Not only did she intend to reveal her work on her own terms, but she also endeavored to control its message. Klint's symbolism is strangely unambiguous, outlined in an almost instructive manner. For example, she wrote that the snail or spiral form represented development, and the colors blue and yellow signified feminine and masculine energies respectively. Klint's work denotes a fixation with organizing and translating the world around her, recognizing life as a series of dichotomous forces, which is not at all a departure from her male counterparts. And on the screen here, we have two works from the Primordial Chaos series. I think I have, yes. So here is an installation view from the Guggenheim where you can see the series, the Primordial Chaos series. And as you can see, it is predominantly blue and yellow. Like other early abstract works, excuse me, Klint's paintings for the temple depict harmonious and polarizing forces. And just real quick, this installation view, I include a number of installation views because it's so important to really understand the scale of these works and how many she produced. These are all from the series, the sub-series of paintings for the temple called The Largest 10. She created the impressive series between the years 1906 and 1915, with the exception of a 4-year pause to care for her ill mother. The cycle of 193 works, mostly large scale, was allegedly commissioned during a seance by a high master spirit at a time when Klint belonged to her group, the Five. The series is comprised of sub-series and sub-sub-series in different categories that all convey various themes, such as the stages of life and evolution, from oneness to multiplicity, and the composition of the soul. Klint described in journal entries precisely how the paintings were to be arranged as an exhibition, though chose to never exhibit in her lifetime. Therein lies the inconsistency that complicates Klint's association with other abstract pioneers. Does an artist belong in the conversation if she did not actively participate in it during the time which she worked? Kandinsky, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Some of Klint's journal pages prior to her first abstract painting of 1906 contain descriptions of motivation paralleling that of other abstract artists, what Kandinsky summarizes as, quote, awakening after years of materialism, turning one's ears to the voice of internal necessity, which might be called honesty, to give expression to mystical necessity, end quote. Kandinsky outlined 3 fundamental responsibilities imperative to the artist. one of which is assuming the role of a spiritual teacher. In effect, he describes the modern artist as a kind of prophet. Kliint wrote in 1906, quote, "You will commence a task that will bring great blessings on future generations. Your mission is to open their eyes to a life that lasts for eternity," end quote. Kliint defines the source of her internal beckoning as a spiritual commission, alleging that a life force from a spiritual plane provides her with the imagery, and ideas found in these paintings. But whether called a spiritual or mystical, the experiences of Kandinsky and Kliint differ very little. These on your screen are also two of the larger scale works from the largest 10, or the 10 largest, Kliint actively exhibited work, as I mentioned earlier, though never her abstract work. This is, I find kind of funny. In a 1915 Stockholm exhibition, she showed landscape paintings alongside Kandinsky's abstract works, while she secretly had over 100 abstract works sitting in her house. But she didn't create work in a vacuum. I think that's important to note, that she lived and worked as an artist in the heart of lively Stockholm, where she likely would have attended avant-garde exhibitions and lectures and otherwise involved herself in the city's cultural happenings. Additionally, the galleries operated by the Art Society were located in the same building as her studio, and the possibility that she saw Munch's 1894 show held in those galleries is very likely. So there is a level of participation in the art world at work here. These are her three works from the temple paintings, very large scale, entitled, these are her altar pieces, 1, 2, and 3, not in that order though. In examining influences of early abstract artists, the most obvious, the theosophical impact, is also the most intriguing, as it unambiguously takes shape in Kliint's paintings as well as those of Kandinsky. Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society began in Scandinavia around 1889, after which a Swedish faction was established in 1896, and Stockholm became the center of its activity. The capital city hosted conferences, discussions, and lectures, and conducted printing and translating of theosophical literature, such as the 7 Principles of Man from 1892 by Annie Besant, a prominent leader in the Theosophical Society. This essay and other written guides provided spiritualist symbolic imagery of the movement, much of which is unmistakably present in Kliint's work. Besant would make visits to Stockholm in 1898, 1904, and 1907, and wrote a number of books outlining principles of theosophy, spiritual encounters, and visualizing the unseen. Kliint's decades living and working in Stockholm positioned her in the cultural epicenter of the country, which also nourished her spiritual practices. Documented formation of the Five in 1896 coincides with the establishment of the Swedish section of the Theosophical Society, and her 1904 spiritual commission to paint the paintings for the temple aligns with Besant's second visit to Stockholm. In most of her temple paintings, Kliint's arrangement of colors seems to be directly lifted from a color chart depicted in several theosophical books written by Besant and C.W. Leadbeater, another frontrunner of the movement. Her most frequently used colors in her temple series are blue, yellow, red, and black, with blue and yellow representing femininity and masculinity in her own words. Referring to the theosophical color chart, which accompanies Leadbeater's Man Visible and Invisible, published in 1900, a book Kandinsky also owned, various blues symbolize fluctuating degrees of devotion and spirituality, and yellow signifies varying levels of intellectualism. And as you can see on the page, I hope you can see there are various traits, characteristics listed beneath the colors. The repeated dual forces of blue and yellow depicted in Kliint's work were likely representative of complementary forces like devotion and intellectualism, which is an influence of theosophical teaching. These are two works from the Swan series. Besant's impact on Klint's work can be seen in her form as much as the color contrasts. For instance, works from the Swan series echo lithographs in Besant's and Leadbeater's Theosophical Manual called Thought Forms of 1901. Regarding the images in Thought Forms, Besant describes the blue as representing devotional thought, and in combination with the red, produces a sense of anxiety. In other images in the book, she describes the yellow as intellectual fortitude, mental strength, and courage. Another fascinating claim for Theosophy's direct influence in Besant's The Seven Principles of Man of 1892, which defines the term abstract in spiritual context. Besant writes, "Let the man be a philosopher, and as he ponders over some knotty problem, he will lose all consciousness of bodily wants, of emotions, of love and hatred. His consciousness will have passed to the plane of intellect. He will be abstracted, i.e. drawn away from considerations pertaining to his bodily life and fixed on the plane of thought." These are other prints from that book, Thought Forms. We can see in a lot of Klint's work references perhaps to surely the palette, the line, the symmetry. The idea of abstracting thought from the physical plane into a realm of intellectual consciousness was precisely the aim of the new art. Specifically, Besant's influence on Kandinsky should be emphasized in seeking to further parallel Kliint with other forerunners of abstraction. His early Composition 4 of 1911 borrows line, color, and velocity from an illustration included in Thought Forms, which depicts the visualization of musical energy using the work of several composers. And Kandinsky would go on to write at length throughout his career about his ability to see music. If Kliint was exposed to cultural and artistic elements in the same way Kandinsky, Mondrian, and Kopka were, and responded in comparable visual language, her discomfort or unwillingness to exhibit within the public sphere should not call her artistic intention into question. She produced work in an effort to make the invisible visible, and in doing so, modified pictorial language to fit her inner necessity. Luckily, we see that the conversation is changing, and her body of work, the temple paintings, are being exhibited all over the world now. The piece that you're seeing on the left is from her very large scale, the 10 largest, and then from the Dove series on the right there. I love this shot from the Guggenheim where you can, I hope you can see my cursor. Here in the top center are her 3 altarpieces. Again, just to kind of get a sense of scale. In the middle center, the smaller works are from the Evolution series. Down here, predominantly blue and yellow, we see Primordial Chaos. Over here, we see the very bottom of the 10 largest. In the middle left is works from the Swan series. And directly to the right center is the 7-point star series. And above that is from the Dove series. Another installation view to get a sense of scale of not the 10 largest size, but you know, even her smaller works are still pretty sizable. Again, for scale, I believe this is from the Stockholm show. And then, honestly, I struggled with, you can't fit 193 works on a slideshow that's supposed to last 30 to 45 minutes. So I tried to give you as much as possible. These are all from the 7-pointed star series. And it's interesting to see the common thread in all of them. You know, the swirling line she is attempting in, not so much the top left, but she's attempting some sort of sense of symmetry. The bottom left is interesting because we do have figures and we do have a form that looks like a snake. And on the right, we have that snail shell or the spiral in the center, which according to her signifies development. On the left is a painting from the Evolution series of the temple paintings. We see the blue and yellow. We also see it on the right, which is also from the 7 Pointed Star series. And I just wanted to end on this because I wonder what Hilma af Klint would think if she knew that she didn't want to exhibit her work. Then she left the instructions, don't show my work until 20 years after, at least 20 years after my death. And now we can literally cover up with her work. I do have my references here and can pull up, if anyone's interested, can pull these back up. And I wanted to let you all know that there is a new documentary out there called Beyond the Visible, Hilma af Klint. I've not watched it yet, but it's available for streaming. And I'm sure a quick Google search will let you know where to find it. But I'm sure it's great. And we can open for questions.
Thanks, Joe. Hey, everybody. Since Senior Wednesday is so very much about community, I'd like to open this up to all of you and give all of you the ability to turn on your cameras and turn on your mics, and we'll have a Q&A and a discussion with Joe. So give me a few minutes. I have to do this one by one, but we will get you all in here. And you know, if you have the choice of turning on your video camera or not, we hope you all will, because I miss your faces. Hi, Dawn.
Hi, Don.
Hi, Jana. Who else did I hear? Ksenia?
Joe.
Oh, hi, Joe. Oh,
Yeah.
hello, Joe. Yes. Do you recall we met just a week or two into your arrival
You were
at the
here in the
Ulrich?
office. Yep, I do remember
Very glad to have you here. I posed a question in the Q&A, but I guess I can just ask it of you. I can see. I'm very unaware of Kliint, so this is wonderful that you're sharing this with me, with us. But I could see how there was maybe some resistance to classifying her in with the abstraction artists. A lot of what I see reminds me of a good friend of mine who was there in the design department at WSU before he retired 20 some years ago. I see a lot of design, what I would call design in her work. Very clear shapes and color pattern, color studies and everything. So I previously to your talk wouldn't have called those abstractions, and now I'm seeing them in a new light.
Good. I see what you're saying. But I think the dive into sort of her background and how we know to decipher her work on her own terms, right? The writing that she left behind. I don't know that classifying them as design is appropriate, but I see how just looking at these images, absolutely. That's where intention is, it's such an interesting thing too, because then if we look at intention in terms of artists and other movements, what they were intending to do as opposed to how their work was interpreted, a lot of times is not congruent.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, but in terms of off Kliint, I think it's necessary to look at those sorts of things to be able to reclaim her into the abstract conversation.
Certainly a departure from realism,
Yes,
and such a difference for that period of time.
absolutely. I find it fascinating that she continued to paint landscapes and portraits and show those. I think that's always going to kind of be a mystery or a speculation. Is there's really no clear explanation for why she never wanted to exhibit the works or why she wanted to wait until after her, so many years after her death.
Are her realistic paintings exhibited anymore?
That's a really good question. I don't have that answer, but that would be really interesting to learn.
Yeah.
I think the big push right now is to, consider her a pioneer in abstraction. So it's mainly the temple paintings that are being shown. I know that her journal pages in some shows are also included.
Joe, can I ask a quick question?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious. I've also been long fascinated by F. Kliint, and I really appreciate it. I got to see the Guggenheim show.
Good. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, no, Leslie and I happened to be in New York for a work trip, and that was like the one thing we absolutely had to see, and it was awesome and amazing. But it was also so big, and it was so much new content to take in that, we had limited time, that I really appreciated this kind of refresher and thinking about how she compares with her contemporaries and the research you've done. But I'm also just curious, what got you interested in it?
Trying to think back. I think it was just that question, the intention part of it, to be honest. So there are a lot of artists around the time, female artists in the late 19th century, early 20th century that did, the spiritual automatic drawing and whatnot, a number of them that really aren't considered part of the canon. But she wasn't just doing these sketches. She was doing these large scale, colorful paintings. And I think not belonging to the first group that I just talked about and not quite belonging to the pioneers of abstraction, where does she fit? I think that's what was interesting to me, was trying to make a case for her in one or the other.
I have a question. This comes at a really great time for me because I'm talking to a class right now about canon formation and the sort of limitations of the broadly recognized canon.
Mm-hmm.
And I was planning on talking about her work tomorrow, which is great, although I didn't know nearly as much about her work as you do. So this is really adding to my knowledge. I think to me, that's a really interesting question, because usually when we think about sort of women being excluded from the canon, it's not because they didn't want to be part of it. it's for, you know, sort of systemic sexism or racist sort of issues. So, I mean, how does that sort of, I don't know, how should we consider the canon when, you know, her work wasn't publicly shown at the time that she was making it because she didn't want it to be. And, you know, she sort of opted out of having her work be included and potentially influencing other people, other artists, which to me does seem like it maybe that should have some sort of weight in what we consider canon.
Mm-hmm. It's a tough thing to reconcile. She was, as I pointed out, she was actively participating in other ways, right? She was exhibiting work, but not thinking about this body of work in terms of adding to the conversation. That bleeds into intention too. Was her intention to not be part of the conversation? It's a tough thing to reconcile. You make some good points. And it is fascinating that with other female artists, as you've talked about through history, they were just sort of not taken seriously or barred from, you know, certain subject matter and whatnot. And here she actively denied partaking. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't have all the answers. I wish I did.
I mean, I think you make a great case about, you know, how she's sort of operating in very similar ways to Kandinsky, just with the exception of how she presents her own work.
But we can't take into consideration that if, you know, because of the climate of, you know, sexism and social inequalities, if she wasn't feeling confident, you know, if she wasn't taking herself seriously, you know, that could be an interesting way to talk about it.
Do you know anything about her family and what their acceptance of her being an artist was?
Yes, they were very accepting. They were upper class. She was the fourth of 5 children. They, you know, vacationed. She did art classes at a very young age and then graduated with honors from the Royal Academy. They were very supportive.
Mm-hmm.
Joe, I remember from one of the few things that really struck me in the Guggenheim show is that they made a big point of her. So she creates the 10 largest, and then Rudolf Steiner comes to Stockholm, I think. Like, she gets a chance to show it to a real luminary in Theosophic circles, and then he like completely just tells her this is, my memory is that he was very discouraging, and that was kind of the point that she decides to maybe not show it, or that she switches direction in her work. Was that something you came across in your research?
I think with that, it makes for a really nice, clear story, because it gives us a point at which we can say, oh, this is the reason why she decided to not show. I don't know how much documentation there is to suggest that she, you know, that shut her down, for lack of a better way to say that, unless there's something that I just don't know. I think it's just, it creates a nice narrative that's tied up with a bow that we can easily understand.
Wow.
Any other questions?
I wonder, Jana, is this going, have you recorded this, and is this going to be available later?
Yes, it is being recorded, and give me a couple of days.
Sure.
And then I'll have it up on our YouTube channel.
A Swedish-born abstract artist friend of mine spends half of her year in South Africa and half of the year on the East Coast. I know she would have loved this. I didn't think about pushing her into being here, but if I can, you know, send her a link and let her see Joe's presentation, I'm sure she'll enjoy it.
Excellent.
That's great.
And also, isn't it nice to see J. Ray? How you feeling, J. Ray?
I'm great. I'm very happy to be an honorary senior today.
And I just would like to know, and I can research this, but oh, sorry. I'm talking, so Carl is going to talk. Sorry. Thank you, J. Ray. Would like to know where, and hi, Joe. Normally I would have met a new Ulrich employee, so I can't wait to meet you in person. Sorry.
Likewise. Nice to
Try later. Where would, okay, I'll come back on. Sorry.
Talk over Carl.
Okay.
We can hear you, Ruth Ann. Do it.
I have some duct tape, Ruth Ann.
Good, he can bark through it. Do we have any idea where an exhibition would be? Of course, nobody's going to travel in COVID time, but where we might catch this wonderful artist's work.
Like I mentioned, she's now being, that show is traveling all over the world right now. The Hilma af Klint Foundation, started by her nephew, I believe. But if you go online, they have, their website's a great resource, and they'll have all that information.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So is the foundation the owner of all the works?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I wonder where they store them. You need a lot of storage space.
A good question.
Anyone have any other questions? Well, it's lovely to see all of you. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's wonderful to have such a knowledgeable registrar and for you to be able to share what you've learned and what you know with us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Participating and being interested.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I hope we'll see all of you next month and for Terry Evans' talk next week. Be sure and register. You too, Jay.
And so in Swedish, I'll say tack så mycket.
Oh, yay.
Which means thanks so much.
Great closing.
And then Joe would say, varsågod.
Varsågod. Have a good week, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Good to see you all soon.